Alright, we're back. We're talking Final Fantasy. We're here to look at an interview with series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi with Inverse, where he kind of talks about, I guess, like his career as a whole. But he does talk about the Final Fantasy franchise, which is what we're interested in. He does also talk about remakes, and specifically does talk about the remake project a little bit, which is kind of interesting because I don't know that we've ever seen him talk about that, at least on the channel. And really, as long as I've been doing Final Fantasy content on the channel here, like I don't think I've ever really seen him talk too much about the franchise, if at all. Like I feel like it's only happening here recently because of him partnering with Square Enix for the Fantasian like port that they're doing or whatever. Also, there was one part of this interview that I've been seeing kind of making the rounds where people are talking about him being misquoted, about what they need to put into Final Fantasy games, which I have some thoughts on. We're not really going to look at like the non-Final Fantasy stuff because that's obviously the focus here. But I will say I didn't know until looking at this article and them talking about Fantasia Neo Dimension that like the backgrounds in the game are fucking real, like handmade dioramas. Like this picture right here is in the article itself, and I can tell now that it's a diorama, especially after they pointed it out. But with like previous screenshots I'd seen of the game, like I thought it was just like a stylized, like artistic choice, it's really good graphics. But the fact that they went through the effort of actually making this shit by hand, pretty impressive. Like that alone could almost sell the game to me. Like it's pretty cool. Like is that a thing that's ever been done before? I know there's like a long history to video games, but this is definitely the first time I'm hearing about this. Of somebody like taking like something they made by hand, like a diorama, and like taking pictures of it and shit, and then putting it into like a video game, putting like video game characters and assets on top of it. Pretty cool, man. Anyways, let's hop into some Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 1, the moment we completed it and released it to the market, provided myself with a huge sense of accomplishment and achievement, simply because it was the first game that we didn't know what we were doing and how the market would react at the time, Sakaguchi says. In terms of the Final Fantasy that I think is the most complete, I believe Final Fantasy VI comes close and does stand out above the other Final Fantasies, especially because it was the last Final Fantasy to use pixel art in all of its visual expression. So this I thought was a bit of a weird quote, just because I've known and heard for the longest time that he always thought that Final Fantasy IX was like the best Final Fantasy, right? That it was like his favorite, it was the best example of like what he always thought a Final Fantasy could be or should be, right? That's what I've always heard for like ever. So I find it weird that like these days he would be saying that Final Fantasy VI is like the most complete. I guess it maybe depends on what he means by the most complete. But other than, I don't know, like the fucking ending with Necron, I don't really think there's anything missing with Final Fantasy IX. So it's kind of weird statement, I feel like. And he does go on a little bit more of like this pixel art tangent a little bit later, because he talks about like other Final Fantasies that imagine if they were also still pixel art. So I don't know if he's just like these days is in like a pixel art kick, and that's why he said Final Fantasy VI. I don't know. Not to say anything bad about Final Fantasy VI, because I know it's like a very beloved entry in the series. It's a lot of people's favorites. For the longest time, the debate's always seen was whether or not 7 or 6 was like the best in the series, right? So I get why he might think it's like a very, very good game. It's just I've always heard that 9 was his favorite, and I guess again it depends on what he means by the most complete. Final Fantasy has managed to flourish for over 35 years, adapting to shifting trends and audiences in a volatile and unforgiving industry. Each game in the series tries something completely new and different, leaving fans to debate what defines a Final Fantasy game, what is truly the DNA of the series. I understand and know that this is a very widely debated topic, but I really think it has turned into something that has a different meaning for everyone, says Sakaguchi. If I had to give some kind of core ingredient, I would say it's the story and world. These two are a must for any Final Fantasy and the common denominator across all of them. The world setting needs to contain some kind of thematic element that is loosely tied to current events. I think the world itself needs to have some kind of thematic backbone or message that gives a different perspective or thought-provoking prompt for players. So this is the part of the interview where people were saying that Sakaguchi was being kind of misquoted, because there's an article written by The Gamer a few days ago that was, the headline was, Final Fantasy creator says that the games need to be political, right? Which is kind of what it's saying, and it's kind of what the games are. Final Fantasy VII being the most obvious example here, with its real life comparison to like climate change and stuff like that. And us killing the planet, Shinra killing the planet, is probably the first piece of media that really made me look at things in the real world. Right? I don't remember exactly when I drew that comparison, but when I was younger, is on one of my subsequent playthroughs of the game that it clicked one day, because we were learning about climate change and stuff as kids in the 90s. We were learning about that shit in school, and they were talking about it all the time, right? So on one of my playthroughs, eventually it clicked. I was like, holy shit, Shinra's killing the planet, and we're doing the same thing. A lot of games have like real world comparisons and stuff like that, and political shit. Like Inverse gives other examples, like 16 with the crystals being like a stand-in for oil in the real world, Tactics having like a class separation sort of thing. Obviously, have like organized religion with the Final Fantasy X, and like it goes through like pretty much all the games. There's probably some political shit in damn near every Final Fantasy game, at least all the ones that I've played. Even putting aside like the misquoting thing, which I think is a ridiculous thing for people to say, there's also stuff like this. Look, every time like the topic of like politics in the Final Fantasy series comes up, there's always people that are posting shit like that are like, no, I don't want politics in my games. And it's like, buddy, we got some news for you, because it's kind of always been there. When you see people that are complaining about like politics in the Final Fantasy games, they're either people that don't really know how to interpret what they're playing, or they were never really fans to begin with, right? They're just bitching because that's like the modern thing to do for the last like however many years, bitching about like woke shit in the video games. That whole boring ass fucking discussion. Sakaguchi's actual quote, he mentions, story and world being like the backbone of the Final Fantasy games. That's kind of true for pretty much every game. If you don't have like a good story, I'm not going to probably want to finish the game, right? So that is very important to like any game you play for the most parts. World also is a thing too, for sure. But also with the Final Fantasy games, music, obviously. I think music's a big part of like why people love the Final Fantasy games. But also, as for the games having like some sort of like message or some sort of allegory to real world shit, political shit, whatever, like I think that's fine too. There's nothing wrong also with your game have nothing to do with that. If you just want like some sort of fantastical world, you hop into it, you turn your brain off, that type of shit. But again, FF7 was the first game that I can think of, first piece of media that I can think of where I was like, holy shit, this correlates to some things in the real world. And that's probably, if I backtrack back to that stuff, dude, might be why it's my favorite game. It's probably the first piece of media that really grabbed me where I'm like, holy shit, there's a meaning here, man. Whenever Final Fantasy series composer Nobuo Uematsu and I are having drinks together, we like to reminisce about what if Final Fantasy had kept on that trajectory of using pixel art, Sakaguchi says. What would the world look like right now if Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 were all done in a pixel art style of visual expression? If those did exist now, it'd be very cool to see. So this is obviously what I was referencing before, where Sakaguchi seems to be on some sort of weird pixel art kick with this interview, because I could not possibly disagree more. Because them moving away from pixel art is what blew up the franchise. That's why FF7 was such a hit, because they moved from the Nintendo systems to PlayStation, to CD-ROM, where they can make bigger and better games and go 3D. Like, without FF7 like it is now, the original FF7, we would never have the 8, which is a slightly controversial game, but still is beloved. But we would have no FF9 and no FF10, right? Like, my God, I can't imagine a world without 7, 9, and 10, the way they are. Like, holy shit, I don't want to even think about it. Obviously a little bit biased there because my generation of Final Fantasy is the PlayStation era. It's, Final Fantasy 7 and up, right? The old school ones, I've played them a little bit here and there, and they're cool for what they are, and they're iconic for what they are. But, like, my generation is, like, the 3D shit and up, right? So it's, like, I don't even want to picture what that'd be like, If somebody wants to go back and, like, retroactively make, like, a pixel art kind of remake of, like, 7, 8, 9 so that Sakaguchi could be happy, then that's fine. But if the series had continued like it was, dude, it wouldn't be the same, right? It wouldn't be the same at all. And again, hopping back to the discussion we had earlier in the video where he talked about, 6 being the most complete Final Fantasy, but also for the longest time saying that, 9 was like his favorite and what he always envisioned for the franchise and what a Final Fantasy game could or should be. It's like, that's not a pixel art game, right? Like, back when you used to say that 9 was your favorite, Sakaguchi, it was the 3D character models and all the other shit the way 9 looks now, right? So it's like weird that he retroactively is now saying that he wants a world where like 9's a pixel art game. Then it wouldn't be the same game. One particularly interesting recent development is the prevalence of remakes, games that seek to harness players' memories while still breaking new ground. As games become riskier and more expensive to make, more companies are trying to capitalize on titles that already have the built-in fan base and can appeal to nostalgia. It's a tough balancing act, but Sakaguchi sees the value in remakes and thinks that they take just as much energy as making something from scratch, pointing to Final Fantasy VII Remake as an example. While I would not remake anything, remakes have a place in the market and bring value toward both developers and audiences, he says. On the development side, with a lot of the gameplay systems, world building, and characters, the work has already been done. You don't have to deploy as much energy or resources in that field. In the case of Final Fantasy VII, remake producer Yoshinori Kitase was able to redirect the energy towards the cinematic experience for the audience, he says. The remake, in this instance, provides a lot of added value to an audience because of what technology can empower creators to do versus the PS1 era. So it's not really like the most extensive thoughts on the remake project, but it is, the original creator of the Final Fantasy series talking about remake. So I don't know if he's done that, because again, I've rarely ever seen interviews at all with him talking about the Final Fantasy series, because he's been away from it for 2 decades, right? So it's kind of interesting to hear his thoughts, and it's cool that he's not against remakes. Like, he doesn't want to remake games himself, any of his older games, but he's all for, like, remakes in the general sense. There's a lot of people out there that don't like remakes or remasters. They always just want new stuff, but dude, I'm a nostalgia person at the end of the day, right? I'm always down for remakes, remaking anything that I enjoy. I'm never going to be against it, because even if they remake something and it's like a bad remake or it's like shitty compared to the original is always still there. So even if like the remake project had come out and it was all bad, it's just fucking terrible, we can always go back and play the original FF7, right? If it's any sort of like video game that I grew up playing, something from like the PS1 era or something like that, and they want to remake it, anybody, like I'm going to be down, I'm going to be looking into it at least. Like Pokemon, for example, like anytime they remake Kanto. They remake Kanto almost every fucking generation, right? Like, I buy that shit because I grew up playing Gen 1, right? Pokemon Red, Pokemon Yellow, right? So anytime they're like, here's another remake of Generation 1, I'm like, here's my fucking money. Also, it's not like across the board, like I want remakes of everything I've ever played, right? Because we've talked about, you know, the rumor of the 10 remake, and that's a game I don't think necessarily needs it. Obviously, if that happens, I'm going to look into it. I'm probably going to get it. But a big part of why I love that game is the cast and the voice acting, right? So like a remake would be maybe touch and go. We'll have to see. But then there's also the Final Fantasy IX remake, which we've been talking about for a long time now. And that's another game that I don't think really needs it. I think, you know, 9 is damn near a perfect game in a lot of ways. But I kind of want the remake, you know, because I love what they're doing with the 7 remake. I have my problems with it, of course, here and there with some of like the choices they've made. But overall, I love the remake project so far, right? So like I kind of want that for the 9 remake. I guess we don't know what kind of remake it is in terms of like, is it like the 7 remake or is it just like a graphical thing? But regardless, like if you're just going to give me like 9 again, just way more pretty, yeah, I want that all the time. Anyways, though, my dudes, that's pretty much the video. There is more to the interview. If you care to read it, it's linked in the description, as it always is. But we're really just here for, of course, the Final Fantasy stuff. And specifically because it's the guy that helped create this series talking about Final Fantasy. Pass off to you guys, of course, what are your thoughts here? Do you agree or disagree with some of the stuff that Sakaguchi says in this interview? Like, would you have wanted them to continue the pixel art style? Like, where do you think the series would be now if they continued on that trajectory, you know, with 7, 8, 9, and all that shit going forward? Anyways, that's the video. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Social networks in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, _Whitesea. That's it.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.